Hello, my name is Nathan Marks. I will be walking through my PowerPoint slides here with you. And the presentation today will be on an article written and published by David R. Andrews, and the title is Subjective Reactions to Two Regional Pronunciations of Great Russian, a Matched Guise Study. And before we proceed, I would like to sort of point out something that may seem odd um, to many of you if you're sort of unaware of how the Russian language is talked about, and that is odd for even native speakers. The phrase used here, and my mouse is hovering underneath it, Great Russian, is sort of a really old and odd usage for a paper that was published back in 1995. I talked with a couple native speakers, and they also agreed that this phrase, they don't understand why it was used in this kind of study, this kind of linguistic study. But anyways, we'll be talking about this today. Before we get started into sort of the meat and data and results and discussion of the paper, we should probably frame this. So we'll be talking about aims and background. Um, the sort of aim or goal of his research in this paper was to test the subjective reactions to non-standard pronunciational variants of the Russian language, which do and are sort of lacking in terms of research and description due to this old and sort of salient Soviet ideology of prescriptivism rather than descriptivism. His hypothesis is, though, that non-standard variants of Russian will be stigmatized in traditional status domains. Um, some relevant literature to sort of set this piece of research, this piece of literature into sort of a broad and developed field. Peter Ball, 1983, Howard Giles, 1971, John Edwards, 1982, all employed similar sort of matched guise techniques in order to elicit language attitudes. It is worth noting that each of these three dealt with not necessarily Eastern European languages, but Western European languages. That is RP English, Irish Welsh. And if we move on down, you have William Lambert, who sort of pioneered sort of the match guised as well as the subjective reaction test. And he dealt mostly with bilingualism in French and English speakers in Canada, as well as William Labov and his research involving work examining New York City English that we've dealt with already in this class. Um, Sort of to bring in a Russian linguist who has given much to the field of sociolinguistics within the Russian language is the Russian linguist by the name of Krysin. And his works in 1979, 1982, 1988, and 1988 all sort of very, maybe not necessarily foundational, but they brought to light a lot of things within the Russian language that before his time were very lacking, and there wasn't much work in the sociolinguistic area of linguistics. Zemskaya, 1973, also gave something to the sort of hungry sociolinguists of Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time. The Русская разговорная речь was published. And Русская разговорная речь means Russian colloquial speech. If we translate it into English, and this sort of publication prompted linguists to examine the differences between codified literary varieties or language and actual colloquial speech or varieties. And I put here in quotations something that Andrew states of educated Russians. So it seems that in the beginning, and maybe even still continuing to this day, depends on who you talk to, many Russian linguists or Soviet linguists focused mainly on the codified standard literary language versus how educated, quote-unquote educated Russian speakers spoke. They really didn't care how people who weren't educated necessarily, and educated is a loaded word in and of itself, so but it's just interesting to note. Other relevant literature in Andrew's article also gives other examples to the idea of standard versus non-standard prestige that is discussed in the Milroy article 2007 that we will be discussing tomorrow in class. And it's important to highlight here, as is highlighted in Milroy 2007, prestige is conferred on language varieties by speakers. And speakers tend to confer prestige on usages that are those of higher social class. So these usages tend to be, or these varieties, these pronunciational varieties, lexical varieties that are used within the language that have sort of prestige conferred on them are sort of idealized and sought after by sort of everyone to use because it gives them some sort of new social standing. If it's used by higher social classes or thought to be used by higher social classes, then they want to be able to use this sort of linguistic capital, as we've talked about before, to sort of achieve something that maybe they don't necessarily have. Also, the opposite occurs where speakers will confer stigma, and stigma here is what we're meaning by opposite, which is opposite to prestige. And the stigma is on those varieties that are believed to be lower socially. I also want to put in our minds and sort of bring attention to maybe something that not everyone sort of in class and maybe you've never thought about, and it's Russian prescriptivism, which is very salient even now in sort of what we consider the modern classroom even. Many students of the Russian language as L2 learners run into this very often where they're told they can't or shouldn't or are strongly discouraged to use certain linguistic functions, lexical items, grammatical constructions that are technically colloquial or, as Russians sometimes call them, sub-standard. So many areas of sociolinguistics have been neglected due to this prescriptivism, this very salient prescriptivism in the Russian tradition. Soviet linguists had always tended toward the prescriptive rather than the descriptive in its treatment of the contemporary Russian language. A major break with prescriptivism, though, occurred during the 1960s when the Russian Language Institute of the Academy of Sciences initiated a series of written questionnaires concerning phonological, morphological, and lexical doublets. And without going into too much detail, because that's a separate article for a separate time, this survey just asked speakers, or prompted speakers to sort of fill in some sort of verbal conjugation. And they were sort of seeing how native speakers or how Russians were sort of conjugating these sets of verbs that were in question, and how they differed from sort of the codified standard variety of language that it was perceived. Another frame that we need to sort of get into is the Soviet and the rise of prestige. The Soviet period saw the achievement of nearly universal literacy, which is a super large, grand feat in and of itself, going from almost hardly any literacy back under, well, pre-revolution, where people were still living in small villages and not having access to education. The establishment of nationwide radio and television network and cultural domination of cities such as Moscow, Leningrad, then now St. Petersburg, is coupled also with the migration from villages to larger cities, which gave rise to the increased recognition and codification of standard pronunciation. These factors, in general, favor the growing prestige of the standard, which the standard now is based solely upon, perceived solely upon the Moscow variety, the central variety of Russian. Even lexical differences between the old capital, or one of the old capitals, St. Petersburg, still are sometimes unknown to other speakers in general based on the Moscow variety. So now we're going to jump over to our linguistic variables. And within this research, we have two linguistic variables that are going to be looked at. They are both sort of, they're phonetic principles and phonetic variables. that sort of have regional variation and regional mentality attached to them. The first one is okanya, which is also what he uses and what's talked about within Russian itself. And this is just the retention of the sound o in unstressed syllables. And the areal distribution is that of north and northeast of Moscow. So if we border ourselves along sort of the Baltic states going to the Baltic Sea, so Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania going down and then moving up toward the Baltic Sea, and then going past St. Petersburg to the north there. So between sort of St. Petersburg and Moscow is where this sort of um, variable can occur. And like I said, this is really just the retention of O in unstressed syllables. So the standard doesn't have this. The standard reduces O to some other sound, and you'll see here in a second what I mean by that. So we have this word for milk, and even if you don't read Cyrillic, you can see quickly in just that we have three O's. O, separated by consonants, and the standard pronunciation is malako. So we have malako. But with the okanya variety, it's keeps the O's, all of the O's are retained, even in unstressed syllables. So we have moloko. So the standard again is malako, and the okanya variety is moloko. His second linguistic variable is labeled to him as Southern Russian. I will refer to as SR from here on out, or have it written as SR. And I sort of have not necessarily qualms against this, but if he's going to use okanya, then I think he should keep with the sort of theme and at least use something that's known to be used by native Russian speakers, which is the term in italics here, which can appear with an H or without an H after the G, the G sound. And so it can be pronounced two different ways. The first pronunciation is with just the G, and it's gekanya. The second pronunciation usually will be written with the two graphemes together, the G and the H, or the G and the H, and it will be pronounced hekanya if we pronounced it. And this is just the voiced-velar fricative used as an alternate or in place of the voiced-velar stop. So we have R versus G, and this occurs in one-third of the European portion of Russia. So bordering Belarus, Ukraine, and south as well. So south of Moscow. And we have our example here. We have this first letter here is the G sound, and in the standard it would just be pronounced got. It just means year, but in the Southern Russian guys it would be pronounced got. So we have got and got, which is a really, really common occurrence. This R sound is even preserved in some phrases referring to God and the Lord as well. But overall, it's still very much regional. If we jump over to his methods, specifically the speakers, there were 68 subjects that participated in this experiment. 14 were eventually dropped, reasons ranging from lack of the correct education that was a constraint, or they attested the sort of quality of the audios that were being listened to. So in total, the subjects that were used for the analysis of the data were 54 subjects. Also, the constraints are as followed, that they had to be a standard speaker of Russian. And standard here, I think, just means growing up, educated. He does implement institute or university graduates, and also implements the permanent residence of St. Petersburg or Moscow. So this is sort of his idea of what standard is in this regard. They were male and female, both. He didn't have a set range of ages. There was no emic or etic sort of division here. It was just any speaker in general. So the age range that sort of set up, the lowest being 24, the highest being 67, and then you have others in between. Also, I would like to point out that age and gender were not analyzed for this experiment. The independent variables, though, are the 18 status categories compiled from various other subjective reaction analyses, and as well as other match guys research. They are interesting, kind, educated, intellectual, good-looking, smart, expresses him or herself well, sure of him or herself, reliable, trustworthy, someone I can relate to, humble, honest, sincere, pleasant, friendly, has an important job, has a sense of humor, hardworking, hospitable, well-to-do, and polite. I do want to point out that these were in Russian at first. The surveys were done in Russian, and then they were translated for the purposes of this article into English so that an English-speaking audience would be able to look at this and make heads or tails of it. The elicitation techniques were subjective reaction test, which serves as a tool to find out any initial judgments that the speakers have toward a variety or language. And I explicitly use variety in language here just to encompass all of the possibilities that a subjective reaction test could be. It could be on a dialect, it could be on an accent, it could be on a language in general. Really, you could just do lexical items. Doesn't have to be super specific, but language or variety are the terms that I would most frequently use. Matched guise technique, or MGT, was also employed, and we'll talk about that more in depth in the coming slide. A passage was used, so it was actually read. So there were recordings recorded, and the passage was an abridged and slightly modified version of Tolstoy, War and Peace, a famous novel both in the United States and vastly famous in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Subjects heard 9 different recordings of the text and were led to believe that there were 9 different speakers. More on the matched guise test, just to expound a little bit. The matched guise test is a sociolinguistic experimental technique used to determine the true feelings, if we can ever get the true feelings, of an individual, or on a micro scale of a community, towards a specific language or variety. This experiment was first introduced by Wallace Lambert. We saw him back in the relevant literature and his colleagues in the 1960s, and like I said then, this was to determine attitudes held by bilingual French Canadians toward English and French. The procedure is built on the assumption that speech style triggers certain social categorization that will lead to a set of group-related trait interferences. This comes from Davies and Elder 2004. And without knowledge of the informant, the speaker is actually a bilingual, and the reactions elicited by each of the linguistic guises are compared not by individuals' guises, but as actual speech of an individual. Data analysis. The subjects were asked to refrain from any oral commentary during the course of Andrew's experiment. After listening to a recording, remember 9 recordings in all, the listener was asked to rate a given speaker on a scale from 1 to 5 in each of the 18 different status categories. 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree, and 3 being either between or if they omitted it altogether. Now jumping over to the results. We have table 1 here, and as you see, there is a list from 1 to 18 for all of the status categories. In this one, we have the matched voices, and we have female voice and male voice. And we have, for the female, standard, Orkney and Southern, and for the male voice, we simply have standard and Orkney. The first thing that sort of jumps out is this educated and intellectual, the third category here. And if we look at the numbers across, we have standard being 4.17, so 4.17, and then we have 2.59 and 2.98. And it's significantly marked lower. So the Orkney guys and the Southern Russian guys are both, even for the male, so the male and female sides are marked lower than the standard. And that's what the asterisks mean here, is that statistical analysis was done, and anything that was significantly marked is asterisked. So if we move on, the standard female guise versus the dialectical guises were generally thought to be better educated, physically attractive, sense of humor was had, more interesting, more polite, financially better off in general than the dialectical guises of Orkney and Southern Russian. If we look specifically at Orkney, though, Orkney has a significantly higher rating in 4 categories than the standard. And that is kind, which is number 2, which is 4.07. Honest and sincere, which is 11, which is 4.07 again. And hardworking at 15, which is 4.30, as well as hospitable at 16, which is 4.22. Again, we have other symbols here which are in relation to the brackets that I put around these 4 status categories, and these are the crosses on either side of them. And the crosses are, again, sort of similar to the asterisks, where statistical analysis was done, and it was found that the ones with the crosses are significantly marked lower than the one that does not have the cross. So with our kind, the Orkney guise is marked significantly higher than the Southern or the Standard, as well as for honest and as well as for both hardworking and hospitable. Moving on, we have the breakdown of categories according to relative preference for the Standard, and Orkney guise is exactly the same for the female voice. So the males and females, the breakdown is pretty much the same. Again, the educated intellectual is significantly higher for the Standard for the Orkney guise. I would like to point out that there is no categories in which the Southern guise is rated significantly higher than the Standard. So we did have instances where Orkney was higher than the Standard, but there is no instance at all within any of our categories here where the Southern is higher than the Standard. In the categories where Orkney is favored, so where it was ranked higher, the Southern guise is actually severely stigmatized. So if we go over to our 4.02 for kind, Southern Russian is 3.20. So again, in the same categories where, so for 11, 15, and 16, we have, again, the same thing, where they are in the 4s, 4.3, 4.2, and then the Southern is marked significantly lower at 3.26, 3.76, and 3.30. The Southern Russian guys are significantly higher than the Orkney in only 3 categories. And that is, once again, sure of him or herself, has an important job, and well-to-do. And I think it's interesting to point out here that even though that they were, these are significantly higher than the 3, but it's only in 3 categories, and if we sort of somehow ranked them in terms of which categories gain more clout or more weight, having an important job is sort of interesting that the Southern Russian guise is still sort of marked. And I think that can be explained due to the fact that a lot of politicians during the Soviet era, especially many of you may know of the politician who in English we call Gorbachev, but he actually pronounces his name with a r sound. So he said Gorbachev, so it's a r, and that's how he pronounced it. So we have these politicians sort of somehow keeping this a little bit up with this has an important job. So this might be why the Russians do think that. And then we have this reliable and trustworthy in sort of 8, where for the male voice, it is significantly higher than the female. So even though it's still for the female it is higher. The male is proportionally much higher for this category. So the findings are that, yes, the hypothesis was um, kept, and it checks out. So the hypothesis that is the variance will be stigmatized is absolutely true. And I quote from him, the experiments confirm the hypothesis that non-standard Russian pronunciations are indeed stigmatized. And he puts at least in some domains, which is true. Moving on to the discussion. What has this study contributed? This article and experiment has given insight and brought to light the matter that within the Russian continuum, and I add socio here, sociophonetic variables, okanye, and the use of the voice-to-velar fricative may indeed be treated and viewed differently from the standard and even from each other, which before this it really wasn't looked at, especially in regards to each other. Linguists have talked about, and even Kresin himself has always talked about that the use of the voice-to-velar fricative is still very stigmatized. In a lot of his works today, it still talks about that. The lack of overt study in this area of Russian linguistics makes research such as this experiment by Andrews very important, and ongoing research is always very important in this area. Strengths. Using previous MatchGuy survey questions is greatly beneficial. This helps sort of with the consistency among the field and methodology. The lack of overt study in this area, again, makes this research sort of very important. Drawbacks. I have a few sort of what I think to be drawbacks. My first one is here, so some of the categories be modified, and I ask this because they were all translated, it was done in Russian, and so some of the words, and my example here is the word for humble, doesn't necessarily have the same socio-cultural significance as it does in English. In Russian, the word skromny, which is what we translate as humble and sometimes is translated as modest, doesn't generally elicit the same thing from an English speaker. In Russian, it generally elicits the idea of smart, wise, and intelligence. So it has this idea of smart and wiseness built into it already, where it doesn't in English. So I wonder if certain things like that should be noted within the experiment. My big question is, why is there no male Southern Russian guys? Non-standard upgrading, he does talk about a little bit the fact that Okanya is upgraded. He goes, despite this, it is rare for upgrading to occur in non-standard varieties. He does state that 7 informants argue the authenticity of the production of the dialect guys, so for Okanya or Southern Russian. My questions are, were they the same? Were they the same for every of the 7 informants that argued it? Were they all different? No elaboration has gone into. That would be something of interest, I think. And really, is there a better way to go about this MatchGuy study? Or a MatchGuy study in general? I think that he did do a great job of sort of eliciting these attitudes toward these two varieties that are salient and deeply ingrained within sort of the culture. I think this is one of the best ways to go about it. But is there another way to go about it? Are there better ways to go about it? Questions, as he states himself, that there is further research he would like to go into, and that is gender. His specific and my specific question are also the differences in the reactions of male and female informants, the differences in their reactions to male and female voices. Is there correlation, lack thereof, these two factors? Other linguistic variables. So he focuses mainly on Okanye and the Southern Russian, but there are more than just 2 dialects, more than just 3 variations. I think going a step further and doing other research into other sort of pronunciational variants or grammatical variants would shed light as well on these language attitudes that exist in the Russian language continuum. And here is my reference slide. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it.